Um, so we're looking ahead again to tech and innovation driving the future and what's in store for the agribusiness industry. Our final keynote speaker and panel discussion of the day will be redesigning the future of food through technology and innovation. And I'm delighted to firstly introduce a short video presentation from Ms. Yu Lu, Vice President of the China Chamber of Commerce of Foodstuffs and Native Produce, after which Sarah Zhu from Dairy Australia will moderate a panel discussion with Ben van Delden, Partner and Head of Agri-Food and Tech and Circular Economy Advisory at KPMG, and Professor Ben Hayes, Director, Centre for Animal Science, University of Queensland. So we'll just watch the video now and we'll have the panel shortly after. Thank you.
Australian China Business Council for your kind invitation extended to me for inviting me to this forum and for allowing me to share my points of view regarding the opportunities and the challenges of China-Australian food and agricultural products trade in the context of climate change. There will be three main points in my speech. First point is the three characteristics of China's agricultural trade. The first characteristics of China's food and agricultural products trade is sustained and steady growth. According to the statistics of China's custom, the value of China's agricultural trade reached $304.2 billion in 2021, an increase of 23.2% compared with 2020. The import value reached $219.8 billion, up 28.6% year-on-year. The export volume reached $84.3 billion, up 10.9% year-on-year. In the first 2 months of this year, the volume of China's agricultural trade reached $49.7 billion, up 13.2% year-on-year. The value of imports reached $35.4 billion, up 10.2% year-on-year. Exports reached $14.3 billion, up 21.5% year-on-year. In the past 10 years, from 2012 to 2021, China's food and agricultural products trade grew at a compound annual growth rate of 6.4%. The compound annual growth rate of imports was 7.8%, and the export value grew at a compound annual growth rate of 3.4%. The second series of numbers is to show the characteristic of the high degree of concentration of import origins and export destinations of China's food and agricultural products trade. In 2021, for instance, the import value from the top 10 import origins accounted for 70% of China's total agricultural imports, and the export value of the top 10 destinations accounted for 66% of China's total agricultural exports. The third series of numbers is to show the characteristic of the high degree of concentration of food and agricultural categories in both import and export of China's food and agricultural products trade. The top 10 categories of food and agricultural products China imported in 2021 accounted for 88% of China's total food and agricultural products imports. In the meantime, the top 10 export categories accounted for 77% of China's total agricultural exports. The second point is the benefits of the bilateral and regional FTAs, which is strengthening the China-Australian cooperation in food and agricultural products trade. In recent years, with the process of transition in the China-Australia FTA for agricultural products tax reduction, bilateral agricultural trade has shown steady growth. According to Chinese customer statistics, the agricultural products trade value between China and Australia in 2021 was $10.5 billion. Specifically, China exported $1.1 billion of food and agricultural products to Australia and imported $9.3 billion from Australia. Australia has been an important partner of China's regarding agricultural trade, the sixth largest source of China's agricultural imports and the 19th largest export destination. The food and agricultural China exports to Australia mainly include grain and starch products, vegetables, and aquatic products, and the export value of the top 10 categories accounts for 78.5% of the total export value of Australia. The food and agricultural products China imports from Australia mainly include meat, dairy products, grain, dried nuts, and fruits, and the import value of the top 10 categories of imported products accounted for 95.4% of China's total imports from Australia. One of the most significant things in China and Australia are both contracting parties of the RCEP, with over 90% of the agricultural products being tariff-free within the RCEP parties. The agreement was a historical new breakthrough in terms of agricultural openness. As for China-Australian trade, 91.5% of products exports from Australia to China are zero tariff. On the other hand, 98.5% of products exports from China to Australia are zero tariff. At the same time, the negative list mechanism was adopted in the field of agricultural investment, which improved openness of agricultural investment and enhanced the transparency of policy. The RCEP agreement has promoted the development of China-Australia's agricultural trade. In the first 2 months this year, China-Australian agricultural trade reached $1.9 billion, up 24.6% year-on-year. Specifically, China imported $1.7 billion from Australia, up 25% year-on-year. Exports to Australia were $197.6 million, up 21.4% year-on-year. The third point is the opportunities to promote sustainable development of food and agricultural products trade between China and Australia. COP26 conference emphasized to drive a net zero economy. That is, by the second half of the century, we should be producing less carbon than we take out of the atmospheres. In order to achieve this goal, the animal husbandry industry in the agricultural sector face a relevantly large challenge. Meat and dairy products are among the most important products in the China-Australian trade. These two categories of food account for 32.3% of China's total food and agricultural imports from Australia in 2021. To achieve the net zero goal, it is an urgent task for China and Australia to optimize cooperation across the entire industry chain of breeding, raising, slanting, processing, storage, transportation, and consumption. It's worth noting that the younger generation of consumers pays more attention to better production, better environment, and better health. To achieve net zero emissions, Chinese and Australian industries and companies can also cooperate in research and development, investment, and trade of new protein products, including plant-based products. The future development trend of the food industry will be more focused on 3 T's, which stands for food technology, information technology, and biotechnology. Therefore, the close cooperation in technological innovation, information exchanges, and experience sharing between Chinese and Australian industries and enterprises will promote the healthy and the sustainable development of China-Australia agricultural trade. Established in 1988, China Chamber of Commerce for import and export of foodstuffs, native produce, and animal byproducts is the largest industry organization for food and agricultural products trade in China. We provide service for enterprises that engage in food and agricultural products trade in China. I have noticed there are several representatives from meat, dairy industry organizations and enterprises in Australia on today's participants list. My friend, I believe we must have met during the CIIE or other relevant events in China. I'm happy to see my old friends today in this event. Please accept my sincere regards. And it is always a pleasure for me to meet new friends through such a precious online communication opportunities. Food has always been a bond between the Chinese and Australian people, and food has also shortened distance between the hearts of the Chinese and Australian people. Looking forward to the end of the epidemic so that we can see each other face to face and promote the bilateral food and agricultural trade closely shoulder to shoulder. Thank you for your listening. I wish you all good health and good fortune, and this forum a complete success.
Thanks a lot for this speech. We heard a lot of numbers and figures to show how important the trade between the two countries. And then in order for us to sustain this important trade, we're here to talk about the sustainability of all this. So Ms. Yu also mentioned the importance of technologies and innovation to make sure all this trade and the sectors, agricultural sectors, are sustainable. So I'm having actually two guests, two panelists here to explore some of the new technologies, new ways of doing things here today. So firstly, Ben Van Delten. He's the partner and head of agri-food tech and circular economy advisory at KPMG. And I've got another Ben who is online, Professor Ben Hayes, and he's the director of our Centre for Animal Science, University of Queensland. I can see you, Ben, is online. So I'll quickly introduce the two Bens with us today. Firstly, Ben here sitting in Melbourne. Driven by a clear sense of purpose and a passion for the agribusiness sector, Ben has worked extensively in this sector on both sides of the Tasman. He was a judge and steering committee member of the New Zealand Food Awards for several years and active participant in New Zealand's agribusiness industry before relocating to Australia in 2014, where he now leads KPMG's agri-food tech business. Ben advertises governments, corporates, startups, accelerators and VCs on optimizing their digital agriculture strategies and circular economy opportunities. Ben held the position of head of markets for KPMG Australia for 5 years before stepping full-time into operations advisory focused on the agri-food industry. Welcome, Ben. And over to the other Ben in Queensland. Professor Hayes has extensive research experience in genetic improvement of livestock, crop, pasture, and agriculture species, with a focus on integration of genomic information into breeding programs, including leading many large-scale projects which have successfully implemented genomic technologies in livestock and cropping industries. He's the author of more than 250 journal papers, including in Nature Genetics, Nature Reviews Genetics, and Science. So we're getting into some scientific grounds now. So I'll probably start from Ben here in Melbourne. And if you can tell us a little bit about some of the research projects that you are leading, especially in the circular economy and some of the data exchange platform.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And it's great to be here. And I think some of the topics that I might share are builds from the earlier agenda items that speakers would have touched on. I think, first of all, it's really important to just realise that to get to net zero, to decarbonise a supply chain takes a supply chain. Each business has a role to play, but it's about how do we bring our capabilities together and actually lean into that problem in a joined up collective way. So that's the natural link between net zero, decarbonising, sustainability and circular economy, because you can't be circular on your own. So some of the projects that I think are really interesting, looking out across the Australian landscape, is taking that industry view. Really looking at what the materials are that are flowing through an industry, understanding where we might not be seeing opportunity in waste streams. And I think the real value for this industry is to explore how innovation can extrapolate value out of what is otherwise a byproduct that we look past. And if I come from a dairy example, a really interesting one that struck me was just looking at the role of salt in the dairy production process. So if you think about the process of producing milk, it all begins on the farm. The farm produces the right feed environment for the livestock. So that's largely pastoral based, grass based, but often there's mineral blocks or lick blocks as they're referred to in the industry. And they're a combination of nutrients that the livestock need. So that's your first injection of salt. Then when the milk arrives at the factory for processing, if let's say it's being made into cheese, the curds and whey are separated and you end up with cow water, which is a highly saline waste stream. And that's a problem in the industry. It gets put to use for growing fodder. But as you move further through the production process, you then see salt being purchased to be put back into the manufacturing process. So when you just take that one item and think about it and go, well, hang on a minute, it was already in the milk. Why am I taking it out of the milk? Why am I putting it back into the environment to then purchase salt from an offshore market to manufacture a block of cheese here in Australia? And if you look at it like that, you look for where's the opportunity, and the opportunity is to harvest back that salt from that salt water, for example. But where it gets really exciting is when you then think, okay, now actually what I'm trying to do is decarbonize a supply chain. And where's my biggest emission? And my biggest emission is back on the farm. It's the methane emissions, which I'm sure has been covered a lot today. And one of the areas of discovery at the moment is bromoform as a methane reduction agent that comes from Asparagopsis. And Asparagopsis is a seaweed, and seaweed likes salt water. And so then you pause and go, well, hang on, why shouldn't we be thinking about challenging this whole system and designing onshore Asparagopsis ponds closer to the dairy factories where we use that waste stream? So the cows end up giving us the salt water produces the Asparagopsis goes back into cow feed, so cows feed cows. So we close those nutrient loops and be really mindful of the impact back on farm, and then you also end up with biofertilizer alternatives. So that one example in dairy is, I think, a really good one, because the marine industry plays a role with the dairy industry. So we have to take a joined up approach to decarbonising. So, but you can't do that easily on your own, and that's where the interesting projects are really evolving around regional circularity cooperatives that are coming together to bring different actors to that challenge.
Yes, I remember you showed me a very colorful graph to show this how this circular economy works, and especially that a very good example is in Bega Valley. So is it possible to extend this kind of circular economy example to other regions in Australia or even internationally?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And just that small example, I mean, it's a pretty small region, but you have to begin locally to be able to work out how to make the difference. But as we have the conversation about, what that Bega Circular Valley program is about, the interest that comes from, larger national organisations. I don't know, Hugh Killen was part of the planning for today. AACO, our largest landholder and livestock operator, doesn't have an operation in Bega Valley, but is part of the program. Why? Because when we start to work on stock feed, when we start to work on energy transition on farm, these are all transferable challenges, and those solutions need to be scaled to other regions, and not just in Australia. So very interesting to see some unexpected technology companies coming to the table as well. They want to be part of that decarbonisation agenda. They want to fund and be involved in creating carbon credits, but doing so in a way that there's a great consumer story. They want to be able to connect to where this is happening on farm. So yes is the answer. You can start local and have a national and international impact. And I think that the key point is no one organisation has all the answers, so you've got to create the mechanisms to bring people together to co-invest towards getting to zero.
Sounds great. I think I'll probably come back to that point again later on, but I'll move on to Ben in Queensland. We talked a lot about the methane emission and reduction as well. I believe you actually have been working on some of the projects with the animals to do that type of work. Over to you, Ben.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here today or be on this panel. I've had many wonderful trips to China. I was always hosted really well, and food was always a big part of that hosting too, and the food was terrific. Yes, so as I'm sure you've spoken about previously, cattle have this incredible ability to convert low quality forage and grass to high quality protein in the form of meat and milk. But unfortunately, when they do that, methane is a byproduct of that. So our work is focused on reducing that methane from cattle, and specifically in the grazing situation. So there's really good technologies coming out now. As the previous Ben said, there's seaweed that you can feed to cattle, which will reduce methane by a very considerable amount. That works well in a dairy situation where you can feed the cattle every day or twice a day. Works well in a feedlot. It doesn't work so well in a lot of Australia, where the cows are extensively grazing on properties that are hundreds or thousands of square kilometres and so on. So we're looking at developing technologies that address this challenge with grazing cattle. And to give you an idea of the type of technologies we're working on, with our engineering colleagues, we're working on biopolymers that you can put into the rumen or the stomach of the cow with a substance in it that lowers the methane emissions, that knocks out the organisms that produce methane. And the great thing about these biopolymers, they degrade over time in a predictable way. So you can have these methane reducing compounds being released over 6 months. And in these northern production systems, you might only see the cattle once every 6 months or even less. So that's one branch of our technology. The other is to work on the genetics of the animals themselves. And we and others have done work demonstrating there's quite a lot of variation between individual cattle in how much methane they produce. And some of that is driven by the cattle's own DNA. We've got experiments to show that. So what we're developing is panels of DNA markers. So we can take a hair sample from an animal and predict how much methane it's going to produce. Once we've developed that technology, we can start to breed cattle that produce less methane. And this technology is being developed by us in beef and also in dairy by others. The final bit of the picture is the cattle's own DNA controls some of the methane emissions. The other thing that affects methane emissions is, of course, the bugs that the cattle carry. All the microorganisms it has in its stomach, in its rumen, to digest all that fibre. And we know that differs considerably between animals. So we're coming up with tests where we can profile all those microorganisms and predict how much methane cattle are going to emit. And then the farmers will be able to make decisions on which ones they want to keep and which ones they're going to remove from the herd so they can have a low methane herd. So they're basically the three technologies we're working on, and it's targeted at the 22 million or so cattle that are grazing at any one time in Australia.
That all sounds very exciting. Earlier this afternoon, we had a presentation from Bright Dairy based in China. They are one of the top 5 dairy companies, and they talk about a similar situation that they are facing in China. I'm pretty sure they would be really interested in getting in touch and find more details about all this work that we're doing here in Australia. And hopefully we'll be able to do some bridging work to connect you guys together. And then that's going ahead would be generate a lot of cooperation between the two countries. Ben, in Queensland, you just mentioned that you had experience working with Chinese partners in the past. So are you actively seeking for some partners working on those projects in China?
Yes, we've had good collaboration with actually with Bright Dairies at one stage, and also with researchers in the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Science, which was terrific. We'd like to restart those collaborations, and I think now is a great time when we have a really strong common focus We're all about reducing methane from dairy and cattle production. If we don't, there's going to be quite some consequences. So I think we need the international research community to come together on this. And China certainly has some great expertise we could tap into.
That's great to know, and we will definitely pass on any interest groups or business as a result of this summit and going on as well. So back to Ben in Melbourne, for the projects you're working on, are you also working on some with international partners as well?
Yes, we are. And it sort of goes back to that comment earlier of, you need to solve this problem through the supply chain. And so much of what we're producing as a food or a beverage product in Australia is destined for an offshore market. So to actually understand the impact all the way through the supply chain means you have to engage offshore. And just before I come back to the question, Sarah, Ben's point, I think is super interesting, and just to land how real this challenge is about methane at a livestock level. In the Netherlands, for example, at the last general election, one of the platforms that the returned government stood on was to reduce nitrogen emissions into that marketplace. So now taxpayer funds are being put towards buying out livestock from farmers. So basically encouraging with payment farmers to destock their farm systems. Why? Because too many emissions in an intense small area of land. So policy drivers are really starting to affect this sector. So we truly do have to, be mindful of that potential coming to a market like, our markets here in Australia, different contexts, size of land and whatnot. But the important point is there's innovation activity in a market like that has that policy driver that has got a higher urgency to transition. So we have to work with those markets to bring those technologies back here. One really interesting one that I'm particularly alert to, and I think Kirsten, this might help you in your sector as well, because I know aside from growing lots of wonderful grapes, and I was there on Monday, in between the grapes there's lots of grass, which is often mown. So there's a particular business that we've got our eye on in the Netherlands that is extracting through biorefining techniques protein from grass, but also weeds. Now, typically that product, grass, worked well as a protein source for a multi-gastric animal like bovine. But for single or monogastric stomached animals like pigs and poultry, we rely on a lot of soy production. So this innovation, I think, is really interesting, where we can look at using biorefining techniques to take proteins out of grass, which we have lots of, and weeds, which we are typically trying to spray to get rid of, and turn it into a feed source. And not only that, use the byproducts back into horticulture as potential substrates for mushrooms and other things. So we really need to look abroad as well as locally for, I think, innovative solutions. The other one I'd highlight, which has really informed some work here in Australia, is seeing how other industries, other food and agricultural industries, are collaborating around data to better inform decision making. And it's not going to be efficient if we follow the current course in Australia to try and get to a point where we're having climate active or carbon neutral disclosures on a product if we don't have an organised system for carbon accounting, which allows us to measure once and report that data up through all our different supply chain partners. We're just going to create an overarching burden on our food producers who should be focused on quality food production and doing it with less emissions, not accounting for this stuff. So inspired by that, I think the product environmental footprint that we need to be able to roll up from input to production, processing, packaging, transport, export, that all needs to come together in a trusted way. And we're seeing some really interesting data exchange solutions in international markets. So one of the projects that we're working closely on here with the government and 30 other organisations is the Australian Agri-Food Data Exchange, which is looking to try and enable that as one example for sustainability.
So as a result of the platform, are you able to provide more carbon footprint information to the industry or to the customers or to consumers?
Yeah, so the project's in design at the moment, and we're really modelling all these use cases. From a carbon perspective, it's less about the sensing, that's the role of technology, but it's more about enabling the capture and certification and being able to project that data through multiple different supply chain partners. So measure once and report many is the philosophy of it. Make your data work harder, essentially. On some of the experiments that we did, we realized that if you just solve for the sustainability agenda, you're missing the opportunity to really leverage the data for more than just that one purpose. So biosecurity, for example, was a real big challenge in the plant industry where data was being collected manually. And so by the time you realized you had an incursion, it was an after the fact experience to go back and work out where that weak link was. So turning that more into a digitized data sharing environment, we can get real-time data. And to Kirsten's comment as well, the ability to foresight when you're going to actually receive product is so important in these supply chains where timing is everything. So digitizing that, so sustainability plus biosecurity is taking you forward to a really efficient food supply chain that's delivering high quality product as well.
Yeah,
if I add something to Ben's comment, is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Very, very interesting to hear you talk, Ben, because some of our research is going down a similar line where we use such data like Ben was describing to build what we're calling digital twins of beef enterprises and beef supply chains. So we have a very detailed computer simulation underpinned by data like you're talking about. And once we've got that digital twin of the supply chain, we can start to look at what happens if you apply this technology. How much methane reduction can you expect? How much biodiversity will you have on your property, which is going to be important for the future? And how profitable will you be? And the digital twins that we're looking to construct will take all those dimensions into account at the same time. It's not a simple thing to do, but building on things like Ben's talking about, it becomes possible.
All this sounds very exciting. And what's the outcome will be, the platform will be finished? Do you think it's in a very early stage of building at the moment?
So there'll be a business case for funding in September. So we've accelerated that project because of the demand from stakeholders, which is a pretty good sign, I think, of the potential for it. But the good news is the technology is not difficult. The difficult thing is getting everyone together to collaborate and agree on the governance structures and what the use cases should be. So we spend all of our time talking about, but is that problem really big enough? Are we really applying ourselves to the most gnarly challenge with this project so that we address things that are going to really make the biggest impact throughout the supply chain? So that's the exciting part. But I think, all going well, it's probably the end of next year that the lights would come on.
That sounds good. Okay, I'll open these questions to the floor and to see if any questions from the audience. They're having a long day, apparently. Oh, one?
Yeah, just a question/comment. I wear a few hats in Vancouver, of course, Australia. I've spent a lot of time in China, but I also operate a commercial livestock cropping operation in southwest Victoria. So a foot in both camps, or the supply chain. One of the challenges, and it's not just from the Bens or Bill and Ben's or whatever today, but is getting all of this down to the grassroots level of producers and and I'm talking farm level producers, because that's where a lot of it actually starts and where a lot of the greenhouse gas emission issues seem to be. There's a lot of people out there committed to this, not because of regulation, but because of a desire they believe in it philosophically. They believe it's important to be able to have the right to be at the commercial table to do the deals. not necessarily expecting a premium, but I see a massive disconnect in embracing grassroots commercial producers in this space at a relatively early level. And I was saying to someone earlier, it's a bit like trying to get your head around a mobile phone plan. There's so much devil in the detail. There's so much snake oil type stuff going on out there. How do we as a sector, as an industry, create that seamlessness to get people really on board in a way that's clear, decisive and manageable for the people right at the beginning of the supply chain?
Yeah, shall I take that one, Sarah? Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it really plays out when you sort of come back to at the and sorry, Will, I'll touch on Coles as the retailer. When an organisation like Coles sets a target informed by its customers to be carbon neutral by a point in time, 2050, setting a reduction target by 2030, that's really forcing all that activity back through the supply chain to think about, well, how are we going to deliver that? Because buying offsets is not the answer. We actually have to change the way we produce. But if you think about that commitment, that obligation, that statement that a retailer makes, that's created a commitment to change. Now, the way you can get there is work with suppliers that have taken that activity into account on farm and changed their farming practices. So if I can call a farmer a high carbon farmer or a low carbon emission farmer, a good guy or a bad guy, depending on how you want to look at it, the good guy costs the retailer less than the bad guy. So someone in that supply chain is going to have to make a payment for the fact that there's been, carbon intensity occurring in the supply chain. Unless you can avoid that by changing the farming practices, which is, as Ben was talking about, all the work being done to try and change the inputs to livestock to drive down emissions. But in the dairy sector, that, from a dairy point of view, that's close to 60-70% of the emissions is what's occurring on farm. But I think the other thing we have to be mindful of when all that work goes in on farm, there's also a lot of work we can do at home as well, because when you put that in the mix, those are the two biggest ends of the emission equation, and both of them are really hard to deal with. So not just the on-farm activity.
So I might, if you don't mind, add something there. So at a different level, maybe a few steps back, we're about to embark on a large project where we roll out some of these technologies on producers' farms. So we're about to have a project where we see how they roll out in practice. And on those farms, we'll be measuring everything, like the methane emissions from the cattle, the amount of carbon sequestered in the soil, and so on. So we're currently looking for partners in that. So if someone's interested, please contact us. But I think that has to happen to really proof some of those technologies and make sure they work at scale in practice.
And I think as we mature, what we'll see is a change in the commercial relationship through the supply chain. So if you're doing the right thing in your business, then how do we incentivize and reward that? Because we know it's an avoided cost, the avoided carbon cost further up the supply chain. So, and there's industries that are going to be really challenged with that, because we've got, the dairy code that was set before we imagined having a conversation about collaborating around carbon emission reduction. So how do we decouple, the restraints on producers and processors under a code like that to introduce new incentives for people to collaborate on decarbonising, because it's an investment and you need some certainty that you're going to get the return off that investment. So some really interesting legal challenges coming back in as well.
I probably throw in a quick example that that's happening in dairy industry, where I'm probably not the best person to talk about this, but we are doing dairy industry together with retailers like Coles, working together on the Australian Sustainable Packaging Roadmap to 2025. So as part of that program, we are starting to recruit farmers to do a recycling of silage packaging materials. And we started this like a trial program in I think it was Western Victoria, and managed to aiming to recruit something like 80 farmers, but we ended up having 120 people put their hands up and saying they would like to go ahead and try it. I'm very sure that the message is out there to make sure we keep doing the sustainable development efforts, and we need to put the message more out there to the industries and also internationally as well. As Laura was asking about the international efforts and what we can do to showcase what we are doing here and what we can do together with countries like China and other countries as well. I think that's what we are here to talk about this. I know that sustainability is a big topic and hot topic in China as well. I saw the dairy conference, the biggest dairy conference in China last year. The theme was, the whole conference theme was sustainability. So I think in this area, we have a lot of things to work together with, from the technologies, the innovations, and also to the a lot of framework that we can work together with them. The whole industry approach, that we tend to do that here in Australia in a lot of ways and a lot of sectors. I think that's something we are very proud of. We should be very proud of, and we should be doing a lot of promotion in this area as well. So any more questions? Are we just wondering about timing? Oh, one last question.
Yeah, thank you firstly to ACBC Virginia, especially Zach, for putting on this event today. It's been really insightful. My question is for Ben on stage. We haven't really talked about transport and shipping much today, and I guess a lot of the actors that are in this room here are in the ag sector, and that I guess falls into their like scope 3 emissions, so it's not really focused on by the people in this room. I'm wondering, what do you think are the main drivers that can decarbonise the diesel-based transport that ships Australian produce and products around the world and around Australia?
Yeah, that's a good observation, because there's so many other issues to focus on that, sometimes transport doesn't get the attention it needs. But I'll answer it perhaps through a circularity lens. When we look at the circular economy opportunities for Australia, some $77 billion worth of GDP impact from the built environment, transport, and food and ag. So transport is a really fundamental enabler of new value in Australia. The volatility of energy pricing, because we're dependent on a fossil fuel that's scarce and we're bringing so much of it in internationally, creates that impact. If you apply the principles of circularity, it's about trying to make full and optimal use of resources, and so much of our byproducts in agriculture lend themselves to be utilised as a fuel alternative. And we need to look at what's happening in markets around the world where horticulture businesses are producing their own biofuels that are powering the trucks that are going to pick up the product from the fields. We're not doing enough of that in Australia. I think there's a real opportunity to do more of that, as well as looking at the incentives around accelerating hydrogen energy solutions as well. Now, these are difficult challenges, but we're not going to get fully to zero unless we start to really address, as you say, the fuel inputs going into transport. But we waste a lot of transport resource as well, and that's again something I think is really interesting about taking a regional lens. Is if you understand the material flows at a regional lens, you can optimize everything. And too often we've got empty return truck movements. Too often we're scheduling pickups that are coming back with less than full loads, and it's purely because we don't have the data and the insight to be able to really make more informed planning decisions. What will speed us up down that path, I think, is some of the work that government's doing around strategic activation precincts that have got a real focus on advanced manufacturing and alternative energies starting to come through. So they're in the regions, they're in the places where there's bio sources to create some of these energy solutions. So it won't happen overnight, but it's certainly, I think, a really important focus.
Thanks, Ben. And I think, we have to call it a day for this session. And thanks a lot for Ben and Professor Hayes in Queensland.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Ben and Lily just has a couple of gifts to the people here in the room. Sorry, Ben, you're missing out. Never. So today's been a wonderful session. Thank you for persevering. Thank you for all being here. It's really highlighted our commitment to the Australia-China relationships, which we know has so many opportunities in store, particularly around sectors that are working on zero emissions. Special thanks to each of our speakers and panellists for sharing their time and expertise and making such valuable contributions to the discussions. And to you, our guests here and online, thank you very much for your support. In closing, I'd just like to reinforce the underlying messages of today's summit. Australia remains open for business and committed to bilateral business relationship as Australia and China work together collaboratively to address shared risks. ACBC, with our strong network of engaged businesses, sits at the forefront of the trade relationship, and we remain committed to assisting business on both sides to find mutually beneficial pathways to success. We are inspired by the high-level bilateral dialogue we facilitated last year on zero emissions in the energy and resources sector, and will be following today's excellent agribusiness session with further Green Channel-focused events across other sectors. To those of you who are ACB members who are here and online, thank you so much for your ongoing support of our work. To those of you who are not members, why are you not? We'll be in touch and send you some information on our upcoming activities, including our Green Channel initiative, and hope we can find ways to work with you. Without the financial support of our sponsors for this event, as we mentioned earlier, it would not have been possible. So again, I do want to thank Coles, Agriculture Victoria and the Langham, and also Laura Mattiazzi and Will Mulholland, who have really spearheaded this as the leaders in our Agribusiness and Food Working Group. You've been outstanding. You just wouldn't stop, and it's been fantastic. I also single out Zach Eggleton from ACBC in Victoria for his outstanding work to bring together all the elements of this show. So thank you very much, Zach. You've done a great job. And boy, we've had so many changes. It's been incredible, but well done. And our volunteers and staff who've also helped, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon, either in person or online at another one of your events. So a very good evening. Thank you.